I want to introduce our lunchtime keynote. We thought what we'd do is have a discussion with two of America's great leading public intellectuals, perhaps two of the leading public intellectuals in the world, Professor Robbie George and Professor Cornel West. Robbie George, if you don't know already, is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University, where he also serves as the director of the James Madison program. He has his bachelor's degree from Swarthmore, his law degree from Harvard, and then a DPhil from Oxford University. Dr. Cornel West has been a professor at places like Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Union Theological Seminary. I hope I haven't missed one.
University of Paris.
But he's also one of the world's leading public intellectuals. He has his bachelor's degree from Harvard and his master's and doctorate from Princeton University. And I'm delighted, so please help me welcome Cornel West and Robbie George. So we're here discussing religious liberty, and the theme of this conference is Dignitatis Humanae, which takes its name from the document issued by Vatican Council number 2 on December 7th, 1965. Now, one of the things, it was a very controversial document issued at the time, and I think it would help us to understand why. First, what do we mean by religious freedom, and how does Dignitatis Humanae shape our thought or thinking about religious freedom? Robbie, if you could help us with that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to begin. First, Marcus, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here, and especially to be here with my beloved brother, Cornel West. This has just been a wonderful and illuminating conference, and I want to congratulate you on your visionary leadership of Notre Dame. It is the most exciting thing happening in Catholic education, and this is a time when there are a lot of exciting things happening, so being the most important, the most impressive thing is really something. And of course, it is always just such a joy to be with my beloved brother Cornel to talk about important matters. Cornel is America's, if not the world's leading public intellectual. And the price for you of getting to listen to the brilliant and inspiring Dr. West is you first get to be subjected to a little lecture by me. Because I asked Marcus if I could begin with a little roadmap that will help us understand Dignitatis Humanae and its place in the contemporary debate, a roadmap of the competing theoretical accounts of civil liberties, and most especially, of course, of religious liberty. Here, I think we do see some fundamental divisions, and I want to stress, it's very important to understand, these divisions are not between good people and bad people. These are not between insincere and dishonest people and sincere and honest people. These are divisions, and they're serious divisions with serious implications between and among reasonable people of goodwill, some religious, some secular, some on the more liberal or progressive side of the spectrum, some on the more conservative or traditional side. They all across the spectrum claim the mantle of civil liberty, sincerely, the mantle of religious liberty, sincerely and honestly. And there is a considerable degree of overlap, and we shouldn't neglect that even as we fight in those areas where it's inevitable that there's difference. But I want to provide a little map so that we can see where those differences are and how the concrete things that we are debating reflect deeper differences of ethics and most especially philosophical anthropology, our understanding of the human person. So I think it's fair to say that the most prominent account of basic civil liberties and religious freedom in our own Western societies, most especially in the United States, but not just in the United States, of the second half of the 20th century, that's provided by theorists who want to derive our basic liberties, including religious liberty, and understand it in light of abstract commitments to principles of fairness or equality. So we want to derive our specific rights from the abstract principles. The premier example of this, the most influential thinker, Cornell's former teacher, the great late John Rawls of Harvard. So Rawls says, we're going to begin with an acknowledgement of what he calls the fact of reasonable pluralism. And here, even I, as a critic of Rawls, cannot disagree. The fact of reasonable pluralism is that in circumstances of freedom, especially religious freedom, reasonable people are going to end up differing, not only about the minor and trivial and superficial matters of life, but also about the deep issues of morality, of justice, of human dignity, of human rights. Now, Rawls says, how are we going to deal with that? Rawls says we need principles of justice to deal with that we can share across the lines of division. And how do we identify those principles of justice? We understand that justice is fairness. This conception of justice is justice as fairness. So we need fair circumstances to identify principles of justice as fairness. So he says, let's imagine ourselves in an original position, behind a veil of ignorance, where we are not allowed to know, we can't know anything that makes us different from anybody else. We can't know whether we're male or female, tall or short, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, can't know whether black, white, Asian, nothing about ourselves that makes us different from anybody else. All we can know about ourselves are the things that human beings all have in common, the things that anybody wants no matter what else they want, the basic primary facts about human psychology, what Rawls calls primary goods. For example, we all want self-respect. No matter whether black, white, tall, short, Catholic, Protestant, we all want self-respect. We all want more opportunity rather than less. We all would prefer more wealth to less wealth. There are these facts that we can know. But behind this veil of ignorance, where we don't know anything that makes us different from anybody else, we choose a set of principles, and those are the principles that we are then committed to living under when we come out from behind the veil of ignorance to find out who in fact we are. I am a black, Catholic, 5'11" person with a disability, or whatever the particular facts about myself are, male, female, whatever it is. Now, on that account, Rawls and others in this tradition, my own great teacher Ronald Dworkin, proposed the critical importance of our law being based on neutrality about what makes for or detracts from a valuable or morally worthy way of life. We should never make law, especially law that restricts liberty in any way, based on our own controversial views of the human good. We've got to be neutral about that. Rawls calls that anti-perfectionism. So we can't have a substantive view of the good. We have to identify the right and rights independently of our conception of the good, which we're not allowed to know behind the veil of ignorance. And so this is why Rawls says the right is prior to the good. You only find out what your conception of the good is when you come out from behind the veil. It can't shape your principles of justice. And you can see where this is going to go for religious liberty, can't you? So that means government's going to have to be neutral, not only as between competing religious positions, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu. It's going to have to be neutral as between religion and anything else. It cannot favor or disfavor religion, and religion has to be relegated to more or less a private sphere of life. It can't influence public affairs or public policy. And this, of course, creates a dilemma that Rawls, to his very great credit, does try to face up to. In his second great book, first book, 1971, A Theory of Justice. Second great book, 1993, Political Liberalism. Rawls says, what do we do with Martin Luther King? Because here's a Christian minister clothed in his religion, in his biblical faith, going into the public square, advocating for the brotherhood of man based on the universal fatherhood of God on the basis of biblical principles. And Rawls struggles to find a way. And he says, okay, we're going to permit that so long as whatever king is advocating can fully, substantially be defended without those appeals to the religion. So the religion is allowed to be the sort of the decoration, the dress, the costume. But the substance has to be something that we can know without the benefit of revelation or biblical faith or Quranic faith or any other faith. So now that's a leading competitor, and that's the overwhelmingly dominant view in the second half of the 20th century when it comes to the secular and more or less liberal or progressive side of it. Now, there are dissenters, even among people on that side of the spectrum, but that is the view that everyone is interacting with. So now what's the competing view? If that's the anti-perfectionist view based on an appeal to abstract right, what's the competing view? Well, the competing family of views we might call perfectionist, and this is the idea that our liberties, including our religious liberty, should be understood, shaped by precisely our vision of the human good. Time and time again through this week, you have heard Dean Cole refer to human flourishing, religious liberty for the sake of human flourishing. He's planting his flag on this side of the divide, not abstract rights, not an appeal simply to fairness or equality, but to a vision of human fulfillment, human flourishing, in which religion is understood as necessary to the flourishing of the human being. But on this side of the divide, where we find Dean Cole, where I find myself, Professor West finds himself in this one too. This is going to get interesting. On this side of the divide, you also find Humanae Vitae. Dignitatis Humanae. You find Humanae Vitae too, but Dignitatis Humanae. But on this side of the divide, you've got a divide. Among perfectionists, there are those who say our liberty should be shaped by an understanding of the human good, but our understanding of the human good should be a utilitarian one. And here the great example, the great theorist is John Stuart Mill. In his great work On Liberty, I'm sure many of you, maybe all of you have read On Liberty, one of the foundational texts of the liberal tradition. Very different from Rawls. It's not an appeal to abstract right. Mill says in the very first chapter of On Liberty, Cornel and I have taught this together, very first chapter, he says, I forego any advantage to my argument to be had by appeal to abstract right considered as something independent of utility. He wants to base it on the human good, but on the human good understood in utilitarian terms. And then, of course, on the other side of that divide, within the perfectionist family, are those like Marcus and like Dignitatis Humanae that say, no, we need to shape our understanding of religious liberty and other basic civil liberties with a view of human fulfillment, of human flourishing, but we can't understand that in a utilitarian way. We have to understand the human good as diverse, as having many different irreducible aspects that cannot be commensurated in such a way that we can make our choices by appeal to a universal principle of advancing the greatest happiness of the greatest number, or doing the thing that overall and in the long run promises to produce the net best benefit of the net best proportion of benefit to harm. We can't do it that way. We need rather to try to understand what the human good is integrally conceived in all of its dimensions, and then understand our rights, including our right to religious liberty, by appeal to that understanding of human flourishing. But it's still a perfectionist account. So just as Mill grounds the right to freedom of speech, chapter 2 of On Liberty, in what? The need for free speech in order to pursue truth, Dignitatis Humanae grounds the right to religious freedom in the importance of the value of religion itself. So why do we need a right to free speech? So we can pursue truth, a substantive end, not an abstract principle of fairness, a substantive end. Why do we need religious freedom? So that we can flourish in respect of the spiritual dimensions of ourselves as human beings. But of course, now we need a definition of religion. And here the document steps up to the plate and gives us a sense of what it is. What is religion in this sense? What is the human good? What is the aspect of human well-being and fulfillment that we're after when we protect religious liberty for the sake of religion? tripartite, the asking of the great existential questions. None of us can outsource this. All of us have to ask for ourselves, what does it mean? What does life mean? What is the meaning of life? What are we after here? What are we all about? The great questions of meaning and value. Where did we come from? Where are we going? These are the great questions of the human good, human nature, human dignity, human destiny. So first is the raising of the questions. Second, answering the questions honestly, not with wishful thinking, not with trying to impress other people, not with conforming in order to get ahead, asking the questions and answering them honestly. And then third, living with authenticity and integrity in view of one's best answers, whether they are theistic or non-theistic, whether they are monotheistic or non-monotheistic, whether they are Christian, Jewish, Muslim, whatever they are, Buddhist, Hindu, living with authenticity and integrity in light of those. And the document goes on to remind us that faith itself, if we come to faith, if our raising of those questions brings us to faith, then faith can never be coerced. It can never be forced. A forced faith, a coerced faith, is no faith at all. If you're only doing the outward manifestations of faith, going to church, attending the Passover Seder, observing the holy month of Ramadan, if you're only doing it for show, you're only doing it because you're under coercion, the government's forcing you to, or you're only doing it because you want to get a good job and you're trying to impress the more powerful elements in your society. Whatever that is not faith. So Dignitatis Humanae teaches us that for the sake of genuine faith, people have to be free to live lives of authenticity and integrity in line with their best answers to the great questions of meaning and value, of nature, of dignity, of destiny. So you see, the flag is planted here on behalf of a substantive vision of the human good. This is the anti-Rawlsian position. Instead of the right being prior to the good is prior to the right. In other words, we can only know what our rights are if we know what the human goods are that the rights exist and we acknowledge to protect. And then the final piece of this puzzle, and end of my lecture, the final piece is this. What's the content of the rights? What's the content of the rights? Now, on the Rawlsian principle, the one that's dominant in the secular liberal side of things, on the dominant one, it's just trying to figure out what's fair by appeal to this abstract concept of fairness. On the perfectionist understanding, where the substantive human good is what counts, the content of the right is shaped precisely by our understanding of the human good. In this case, the good of religion that is served by the right to religious liberty. And that, I think, finally does give us the answer to the question, why would Dean Cole constantly be speaking in terms of the importance of religious liberty for human flourishing? Mm-hmm. It's because human flourishing is the end to which religious liberty is the means. Over to you, Brother Cornel.
Let me just say before you start that I hope this doesn't mean that I can't raise money from Rawlsians.
No, indeed. I want to begin by saluting the visionary leadership of my dear brother, Dean Marcus Cole. Let us give him a salute.
Thank you.
I can see his precious father and mother, Claudius and Mama Cole, smiling from the other side of the Jordan. I'm blessed to know his sister, who's worked with me now for almost 11 years, Dr. Maria Cole. And his family exemplifies a level of spiritual nobility. When I say that, I think also of the First Lady, Angie. Let us salute Angie. Oh, yeah. No, very much so. No, indeed. When you talk about religious liberty, when you talk about religious tradition, you're talking about it. Integrity, honesty, decency, generosity, not just values, but virtues. Virtues always cut deeper than values. Values are tied too often to just subjects and individuals. Virtues are rooted in rich traditions that change over time and space, so that the innovation is predicated on the past, but that past never trumps. Maybe I shouldn't use that. Just forecloses. We don't want Brother Trump to truncate our language. But that past never trumps the fact that the future is always incomplete and unfinished. But I want to say something about Brother Robbie, because I have a deep, unconditional love for this brother, even when he's wrong. We wrestle together. We revel in each other's humanity. We've known each other now for 15 years. We've taught together. Our families spend time together. We travel together. We go to chocolate cities. We go to vanilla suburbs. We go all the various places. But trying to do what? And I say this in all seriousness, because you see, for me, when I think about where we are now, I begin with Plato. And Plato was thoroughly convinced that no democracy could actually flourish for too long, precisely because of unruly passion and unbridled greed and pervasive ignorance, not just of the demos, but also of the elites. And it would always lead to tyranny. That's what he talks about in the Republic. And so there ought to be a Platonic skeleton in all of our closets for those of us who are committed to democracy, because Plato presents a perennial challenge. And when we talk about the greed and the ignorance, and when we talk about the unruly passion, that's not a question of name pointing and finger pointing and name calling. It begins with ourselves. It begins with ourselves. What I love about Brother Robbie, and what I love about my dear brother Marcus, is that given where we are now, we have to have human beings and citizens who have callings, not just careers, who have vocations, not just professions. Yeah. Or in my own black tradition, where the anthem is lift every voice, is not lift every echo.
Come on, Doc.
And when you lift your voice, it means you're willing to cut against the grain. What I love about Brother Robbie is he's willing to cut against the grain. He's like Malcolm X in this sense. He's not like Malcolm X in that other sense.
Probably more than you think.
But what we always loved about Malcolm X was what? He said what he meant and meant what he said. And when he changed his mind, he changed his mind. And when he changed his mind, he meant what he said then. That's very important. So there's no posing, no posturing. It's not Robbie saying something to one group. I've seen him in a variety of different contexts. He says precisely what is on his mind. That's what a blues woman does. That's what a jazz man does. You got to blow from the depths of who you are, changing all the time, over time and space. And that's why we have such a good time together. And also, and I thought about this when I was at the great synagogue of our dear precious Jewish brothers and sisters here in Rome, that the Jesus that we follow as fallible, finite, fallen and sometimes faltering followers of Jesus of Nazareth came from those hated peoples, Jewish brothers and sisters, hunted peoples. And that's the Jesus that brings Christians together. So no matter how beautiful the buildings may be, and I had a deep aesthetic experience yesterday in the Vatican. I said, we Baptists not used to that level. Overwhelming beauty. I mean, and it hit me in so many different ways, it's going to take months. But then I said to myself, in the end, that's still just the means to the Jesus that we're talking about. So that there's always a counter against any forms of idolatry, no matter what form it takes. It points to something, it signifies something broader. Or what my Shiloh Baptist Church, where I come from, used to say, if the kingdom of God is within you, then everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. And that's what we attempt to do on a personal level, political level, economic level. And my question is this, because I think that American democracy is not just in deep trouble, but I think there's a pervasive spiritual decay and moral decrepitude. It's not confined to race, gender, sexual orientation, region. It cuts across every nook and cranny of the culture and civilization, of the precious democratic experiment and the empire with its military, 800 military bases around the world. And so what Plato was providing us with was a challenge. And this has always been the preoccupation of black people. That's why black people are blues people. Ralph Ellison said the blues ain't nothing but a personal narrative of a individual catastrophe lyrically expressed. Nobody loves me but my mama, and she might be jiving too. That's the king of the blues. That's BB. Catastrophe. That's not just problems. It requires more than a managerial mentality. When you talk about catastrophe of death and dread and despair and disappointment, that musters something deeper than just managerial responses to problems that need to be quickly solved. The great Reinhold Niebuhr used to say, democracy is a proximate solution to insoluble problems. There'll always be greed, always be fear, always be hatred, always envy, always resentment. That's what it is to be human. And the history of our wretched and wonderful species is dominated by what Howard Thurman called the hounds of hell. That fear and hatred and greed and domination and subjugation. That's most of human history. And the moments of interruption on a personal level, kindness, sweetness. I know that's part of the motto of Notre Dame, right? Mm-hmm. Life, sweetness.
Yeah. Dope.
That's Edward Sordy. See,
Dolce.
That's Brother Edward's vision. And then the last one is hope, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that the motto of Notre Dame? Our French brother who made it over.
Yep.
And found it way off in Indiana. I don't know how he ended up out there. Oh, we know how it is, but we won't go through the story now.
Free land.
But these moments of interruption, given the chronos, the dominant orientations of so much hatred and greed. And when you look at the American empire, and look at the precious American democratic experiments, right now we see overwhelming greed, escalating hatred, distrust. One of our challenges as being members of the professional managerial class is that the professional managerial class is losing legitimacy in the eyes of millions and millions of Americans, be you liberal, centrist, leftist, whatever. Because the economic gap is so overwhelming. And they associate highly educated, the chattering classes with arrogance and condescension. That's what Brother Trump comes from in part in terms of a major slice of his base. Yeah. And the other part of his base comes from my dear brother Bernie Sanders. Because so many folk who voted for Bernie voted for Trump.
It's true. Yep.
So that all of our talk, which is required, and the panels have been magnificent, I should say, but they really have. But if the system itself and the professional managerial class in general loses its legitimacy, then the future is going to be what Plato talked about. Some form of tyranny, some form of authoritarian populace, some form of neoliberal populism, which is to say the managerial class dictating to the demos. And Robbie and I have similar critiques, and we don't mind it leans a little bit to the left. But I want to end with this, and this is the great challenge of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. This is very important. 1965. Union Seminary. He gives the great lecture for the ecumenical movement. And by ecumenical, he didn't mean just Christians or just Jews, just Muslims. He's talking about religious liberty as a whole. And what does the great Heschel say? He says the largest ecumenical movement in the world right now is nihilism. That's 1965. And the nihilism can be inscribed within Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, it can be secular. We're not just talking about Bazarov and Turgenev's great novel, The Fathers and Sons. We're not just talking about Nietzsche's passive and active nihilism. We're talking about people who have given up on any spiritual and moral dimension and believe that Thrasymachus is right in Plato's Republic. That life is solely about might makes right. Power dictates anything you want and need, and morality and spirituality is a joke and used to dupe people. And if that is the major ecumenical movement, then we got a whole lot of moral and spiritual work to do. And the moral and spiritual work goes far beyond just skin pigmentation or race or gender. It has everything to do with spiritual formation, ethical cultivation, intellectual preparation, moral action, and then concluding with Brother Samuel Beckett, our lapsed Christian, but deeply secular. Try again, fail better. Try again, fail better. That's the best we can do. And we pass it on to the younger generation like these two precious ones at this table right here with the beautiful smiles that they have. Pass it on to the next generation. We did all we could with these catastrophes. Ecological, military, economic, social. Take it and see what you can do with the traditions that we pass on. And so I'm very much with you in terms of your defense of religious liberty. I just hope and pray that it's not too little, too late, because that religious liberty is tied to other kinds of liberties and formations of spirits and hearts and souls and so forth. And that's what Brother Ravi and I have so much fun, because we have a good time. There's joy in this, but it's also very, very grim, very, very dim sometimes.
So let me ask you about that, because you mentioned the idolatry that we see all around us, and Reverend Dr. Eugene Rivers once said that when Satan comes for me, he's not going to come in a KKK robe or in a Nazi uniform. He's going to come in the form of someone who looks like me, talks like me, perhaps lives in my community. In other words, what Dr. Rivers is saying is that we are attracted to sin through the things that we embrace. And we see this in American democracy right now with ideology. We've basically created idols out of our ideology. And what makes the two of you so interesting to us and to the rest of American society right now is that people regard Robbie as a leading public intellectual on the right, and people regard you, Dr. West, as one of the leading public intellectuals on the left. And yet you have this love for each other and this dialogue with each other. And not that you agree with each other, but you can dialogue with each other, something that is absent right now in our public discourse. And so my question for both of you is, how do we get the general public in America to embrace the importance of religious freedom when, as you suggest, there's been a heightened secularization of our society, and there is an idolatry toward ideology that keeps them from even having dialogue with each other? How do you guys do it?
Well, the first point I would make is that friendship, whether it is the individual friendship of the sort you're pointing to between Cornel and myself, or both Cornel and myself and Dr. and Reverend Rivers, friendship, or whether it's civic friendship, what ties us together as Americans or members of another nation, or the friendship we have among people in our own communities of faith and so forth. Friendship always requires that there be things in common. If you are completely separate on everything, there's nothing in common. There's nothing to build that friendship out of. So there needs to be some things in common. But people sometimes are so blinded by passions for the causes that divide them from other people that they fail to see what they do have in common. I look at Cornel West, and what I see is integrity Now, I aspire to have that kind of integrity. So he's a model. For me, that's something we have in common. He's achieved it. I'm still working on it. But it's something we got in common. Dedication to truth-seeking. And not just in the formal sense that we both happen to have the vocation of scholars. I mean in living out your life. Living in line with what you judge to be the truth. No phoniness. No posing. No trying to get ahead by seeming to be somebody you aren't. That kind of spirit of truth-seeking is something that ties us together. But there is no truth seeker, no genuine truth seeker, who doesn't have a keen sense of his or her own fallibility. So there's no genuine truth seeker who is a dogmatist or an ideologue. And while Professor West has profoundly deep convictions on some matters, some on which I don't think he's right, and I've got some profoundly deep convictions on some matters, some of which he doesn't think I'm right. He is not an ideologue or a dogmatist, and I try not to be one myself. And that means that we have to recognize that we could be wrong, not just about the trivial, minor, superficial things of life. We could be wrong about the big, important, profound issues, the questions of the human good, human dignity, human destiny. That recognition is very important to any real friendship where people disagree about things that matter and the things that they are passionate about. There is a part of the Jewish liturgy on the solemnest day of the Jewish year, the Yom Kippur, when the Jewish people set aside the day for repentance and atonement. We Catholics have the confession booth, and we can go whenever we want. We don't go enough, but we go whenever we want.
Why are you pointing at me?
You don't have to go that much because Angie keeps you in line. So they've got it on the Day of Atonement. There's a beautiful part of the liturgy where, as a community, corporately, they go through their sins, confessing sins. It's ritually, it's set out in liturgy, beating the breast. And so we together confess. I'm frequently at that. My wife is Jewish. We're frequently at that Yom Kippur liturgy. We beat our breasts and say, I have stolen. You know, whether you personally have or not. I have lied. I have borne false witness against my neighbor. And then, it's very fascinating. We beat our breasts and say, I have been a zealot for bad causes. Now, there's nobody who's a zealot for bad causes who goes out to be a zealot for bad causes. You think your cause is good, otherwise you wouldn't be a zealot. Every zealot in history has believed in his cause. That's what makes you a zealot. But it's that sense of fallibility that enables us to say, as deeply committed as I am to this cause, and I think it's a good cause, I think it's worth fighting for, it may be worth dying for, I could still be wrong about it. And what that means is we never attempt to immunize our beliefs, no matter how fundamental, no matter how deeply cherished they are, no matter how identity-forming they are, we never immunize our beliefs from criticism. Cornel doesn't do that. I don't do that. If you disagree with something that I believe, however deeply, I want to know why. Why do I want to know why? Not because I want to psychoanalyze you, because maybe you're right and I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, you might be able to bring me to the truth. I'd like to swap. I know there are falsehoods in my head right now. Everybody knows that, right? Is anybody, I shouldn't ask this question in Rome maybe, but I would ordinarily ask, anybody in this room infallible? And no hands would go up because we all recognize that right this moment we have some false beliefs in our head. Not everything we believe is true. We believe some things are false, and they may be important things, not just the minor things. We'd love, wouldn't we, to swap out those false beliefs in there and replace them with true beliefs. But if we shut down the freedom to criticize, if we shut down free speech, if we shut down freedom of religion, if we immunize ourselves from any kind of criticism, we are never going to swap out those false beliefs, because all we're going to allow into our heads is whatever confirms what we already believe. You want serious, deep friendship across lines of division? People need to recognize and honor integrity when they see it among people they agree with and among people they disagree with. People need to be committed to the truth and willing to live by the truth. And that means people have to recognize their own fallibility. We need to, I think, remind each other a bit more often of our fallibility. We certainly need to remind ourselves. Now, if you ask anybody, are you fallible? Again, maybe one person in Rome might think differently, but ask anybody, are you fallible? They're going to say, sure, I'm fallible. We're all willing to recognize that notionally, but when it comes to the really deep stuff that we really care about, we do tend to be offended if somebody contradicts us, if somebody challenges us, if somebody says that we're wrong. And in that kind of circumstance, and this is too much the case in our culture right now, this is part of the spiritual decay Cornel is talking about. If somebody criticizes us right now, we're tending to take that as a personal assault. We identify ourselves so deeply with our beliefs that we personalize things. And if you criticize me for my conduct, my behavior, my beliefs, what church I belong to, I can take that as a personal assault. But I think true truth lovers, truth seekers, truth speakers are not going to do that. They're going to be open to criticism and to sincere dialogue. Now, nobody wants to be called names, and we shouldn't call each other. Abuse, nobody should tolerate abuse. That's a different thing. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about sincere criticism. So if a sincere Jehovah's Witness says to me, as a Catholic, you belong to the Church of the Antichrist, I shouldn't take that as a personal assault. That person cares about my soul. He thinks I am deeply wrong and involved in a deeply flawed and harmful religion. I happen to reciprocate that belief insofar as... But there's no need, there's no reason that even the two of us cannot be friends.
That's right.
There's no reason we cannot be friends, committed to the truth, even though we have different ideas. And that's a pretty deep divide on the most fundamental question.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was thinking, Prince was Jehovah's Witness.
He was.
So you could just ask him, do you enjoy Prince's music? Oh, I love it. Oh, I see. That's going to open you up theologically already. Because if you really revel in somebody's humanity and look hard enough, you're going to find something to resonate in. I was thinking of Brother Eugene, who I've known this brother for 51 years with his magnificent wife, Dr. Rivers, as well, and Sue J. Johnson, who was at Union Seminary almost 40 years ago. When I was at Charlottesville, 2017. We got 21 of us marching against neo-Nazis, the Klan. These are some real challenged vanilla brothers. and they coming up with us with guns, got their mask on. And one of them comes to me and says, you're the one on TV calling everybody brother. I can't stand that. I can't stand that. And I said, what, brother? He said, why you say that? I said, because you see, I come from Clifton and Irene West. I come from Shiloh Baptist Church. I come from the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer. And I was taught that Jesus loves you just like Jesus loves me. And you choose to be a gangster. And I'm a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivities. That's the difference between me and you. So we ought to be praying for each other. But don't kill me. Don't kill me. We ought to be praying for each other. But of course, this is Augustine's Confessions.
Wait a minute, you got to tell them what music was playing. What were they listening to?
When I went through the park, they listening to Motown. Now that is quintessentially American. And then I ran into Brother David Duke, who's Catholic, who's one of the heads of the Klan. That's upward mobility American style. Because the Klan was organized against Jewish brothers and sisters, Catholics, and then targeting black people. But when you come from a people and a tradition at their best and you choose forms of arete, of spiritual and moral excellence, always falling short, but that's the choice that you make, and you decide to be faithful unto death. When you make that kind of choice, It means then that in the face of hatred, you're going to keep dishing out love. In the face of all whatever sorrows coming your way, you're going to keep dishing out joy like a Louis Armstrong. In the face of overwhelming trauma, you're going to choose to be a wounded healer rather than a wounded herder, even though your wounds are real and your scars are there. These are spiritual and moral choices, and you can't do it by yourself. You got to have friends. Yeah. When we down and out, he's in the hospital, I'm there. When I'm down and out, he's there. We're not talking about how he's right or wrong on the scope of the market and same-sex marriage and abortion. We do get to that all the time. But as human beings, and this is not no kumbaya kind of thing, the very fact that we have to say this shows you how decrepit the culture has got. As just brothers who overlap. When he plays a serious banjo and I sing in and out of tune when I can. But it's just that acknowledgement, because in our own families we got political disagreements and ideological contestations and so forth. And if we can't sustain Thanksgiving dinners because the politics have got so poisonous and the ideologies are so Manichaean and truncated, then where are we spiritually and morally? That has always been the question of those who come from 100 years with no religious liberty whatsoever. It was against the law for black people to worship God without white supervision. It was against the law for black people to learn how to read and write.
Yes, sir.
For the first 80 years in the practices under the U.S. Constitution. Now that doesn't mean the Constitution is to be trashed, no. It means the Constitution is also to be measured against the concrete realities and the suffering and the struggles. What is it about the best of these people that after that kind of experience, they choose not to form a black version of the Ku Klux Klan, but produce Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman? And this brother had Harriet Tubman's Bible when we went into the Supreme Court. When I look at Brother Robbie, I'm going to say this. The first thing I see, in addition to his loving-hearted integrity, is his mama and his daddy. Because that's where I first met them, in the chambers of Brother John Roberts.
Yeah, Chief Justice Roberts. It was when I was being sworn in as chairman of USERF, United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and I needed to be sworn in. And so the first thing I decided is, well, I wanted to invite my brother Cornel West to hold the Bible for me when I was being sworn in. Chief Justice Roberts agreed to do the swearing in, and then I wanted a Bible that really meant something, a Bible that was really connected to the true cause of human dignity and human rights. So I got in touch with the Harriet Tubman Museum, the Harriet Tubman House in Auburn, New York, and I said, I imagine that Miss Tubman had a Bible, and I'm wondering if you haven't. Said, oh, yes, we do. And I said, explain the situation, and said I'd like to borrow it to be sworn in on, and then fortunately I said the magic words that Brother Cornel West will be holding the Bible. Oh yes, we'll be happy. We'll be happy to send it down there. So they said a great big magnificent Bible, and so there we were with my mom and dad and my daughter, and we were walking up the steps of the Supreme Court, and I've got that Bible under my hand, and Cornel and I are walking next to each other, and I see Cornel catch the eye of a police officer. He looks at Cornel, and Cornel looks at him, and we just walked by, and I waited until we were out of earshot, and I said, Brother Cornel, what was that with that policeman back there? He said, well, that's the policeman who arrested me last time I was here protesting before and he said, now, Brother Robbie, I don't think I've ever been to the Supreme Court before except to be arrested. And then we were received by the Chief Justice, and he did the wonderful ceremony on
your
the
parents
Bible.
was with their tremendous.
We've had some times together.
We count our blessings.
Although since you mentioned that hospital stay, so I had a touch and go situation back in 2015. God brought me through. And as soon as I got through and in the hospital and visitors could see me, first person's there, Cornel West. He shows up at lunchtime. They just delivered my tray, hospital lunch. So the greatest lunch I've ever had. Cornel and I shared that hospital lunch. And you should have seen the two of us trying to figure out how to cut that Jell-O in.
Well, what you've described, though, strikes me as a catch-22 for us as a democracy. You described a spiritual decay right now.
Yes, yes.
But how do we remedy that spiritual decay without a vigorous and defended religious freedom to allow us to go out and start fixing the spiritual decay? Where do we begin, especially given the limitations that we confront with religious freedom?
There's a wonderful line in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason where he says, examples are the go-kart of judgment. You can't just appeal to a rule to tell you how to apply a rule. You got to have examples. Thomas à Kempis, imitation of St. Francis of Assisi. We can go on and on and on. And all we have as cracked vessels, trying to love our crooked neighbors with our crooked hearts, as W.H. Auden used to say, are exemplary institutions, exemplary movements, and exemplary persons. And those are the ones who allow us to build on the best inside of us and fall on the right side of the civil war that's taking place on the battlefield of each and every one of our souls against the greed, the fear, the hatred. You have to have examples. That's why the Synoptic Gospels rendering that particular agent, that Palestinian Jew named Jesus. But all of the complexity, but the example. Now the Greeks would call it phronesis. Okay, that's fine. The Latins would call it prudentia. That's fine. But it's deeper than just practical wisdom. Because for Christians, it's fleshified, concretized, embodied in relation to temples. Money changers run out. Votes taken. Crucifixion. Roman Empire pushing against his body, and then the bounce back. You see? So example becomes a crucial thing. And the same is true in our relations. That's what our kids look for. They look for examples. People would rather see sermons than hear sermons. And I have nothing against hearing because I'm still tied to left wing of the Reformation. And that's about all we got left is word because the sacraments are about gone, which is part of our impoverishment, but that's another lecture. But in addition to word is deed, witness, never isolated, always tied to those small platoons that Burke talked about.
Yeah, civil society.
From family, we're talking about subsidiarity, that our Catholic brothers and sisters have given us so much insight on. And then for myself, social movements, because I do believe in hitting the streets and going to jail. It's very important, not just for black people, for anybody who's suffering. Poor whites, Muslims in China, Jews in France, Palestinians on the West Bank, Yemenis folk under Saudi Arabian domination. I know how difficult it is with Saudi Arabian-American relations. We know if they had artichokes rather than oil, it would be a different kind of foreign policy. We understand that. Oh, you got a practical. I understand that, but we still don't reduce the moral and the spiritual just to the practical, even as we live in the practical world. Augustine is right. The city of human beings and city of God always in tension. But if the city of God simply subordinate to the city of human beings, then Thrasymachus wins. And might makes right. But that might is always already there, you see. And I think the saddest thing these days is that I think my generation has created a kind of failure of providing the grand examples for the younger generation. The example of the younger generation are market-driven celebrities obsessed with glitz and blitz, the superficial, vacuous stuff. That's what they look for. Whereas when I was coming along, I could see a Curtis Mayfield, I could see a Martin King, I could see a whole host of examples, Mandela and so forth. Not to idolize them, not to fetishize them, each and every one of them sinners too. but oh, what courage. And they became the dominant examples. So I have great respect for the younger generation in terms of growing up in the most commodified, commercialized, and market-driven culture and history of the world. And that's thin stuff. That's the hollow men and women that the great T.S. Eliot talked about with such insight. But there's always hope. You know, I don't want to end on the blue note is always a note of hope, because catastrophe never has the last word. Never. Sometimes it's just a song, sometimes it's just a grin, sometimes it's just a smile, sometimes it's just a witness, sometimes it's just a death. Because the life given to us is also our willingness to give our life back to the God that gave us that life, based on the example that we try to exemplify. And I do believe in Rabelais, who's one of the great disciples of Erasmus. I think Erasmus is probably the greatest public intellectual in the history of modern Europe, that Rabelais believed in fun. So that there's got to be a dimension of fun to it, and joy to it, and almost Dionysian. I won't go too far with Dionysius, but but yeah, exactly.
Yeah, revel in
a certain kind of reveling.
Yeah,
exactly. I don't like this tightness and seriousness of the profession and something. No, you got to be able to laugh and connect and laugh at yourself. Well, I'm speaking truth to power. You speaking truth to yourself? Oh, I thought about that. Are you speaking truth to the relatively powerless? Don't tell me you're speaking truth to power. That sounds like your self-indulgent, self-righteous activity. That's dominant among the liberals these days. The do-gooding and patting themselves on the back. How spiritually vacuous that is. No, the question is, are you wrestling with yourself? The very folk who themselves are catching hells, like the bluesmen and women. Well, they sing the truth. To who? To the poor and the middle classes and the ruling classes and the well-to-do and the white and the red and the yellow and the indigenous, to everybody, because they've already wrestled with themselves. That's spiritual maturity. That's where humility is about. The arrogance is tied to the insecurity. And we've got a highly insecure professional managerial class that's just so obsessed with superficial things, and it's a real problem. It's not just the politicians, it's professionals in general who are living more and more in their silos, so they become echoes rather than distinctive voices that are always singular and unique. My dear brother is a blues man from the vanilla side of town, working class West Virginia, playing his banjo and reading his Plato. And the greatest Italian philosopher of all time, Thomas Aquinas.
Well, I want to underscore what Cornel said about the importance of examples and role models. I mean, all the great traditions of faith have recognized that importance in Christianity and Catholicism in particular, and Eastern Orthodoxy. We have the examples of the saints.
Yes,
they're terribly important. Now, every single one of those saints was a sinner, except one. Yeah.
Which one was that?
Mary. You Baptists haven't gotten the memo.
I didn't get that memo. We just saw the creation in the Sistine Chapel. Wasn't she part of the fall too in that?
Otherwise,
I'm not going to start meddling.
Now we're getting into it. Now we're getting into it.
No, I love my Catholic brothers and sisters. I love my Catholic brothers.
But I want to stress, those models are not perfect. You know, we recognize that those saints we hold up as models had many imperfections, but nevertheless they are models. And I think what needs to be modeled right now are people who have the integrity and the love of truth sufficient that they can model truly fruitful friendships across the various lines of division, the things that divide us. And part of the way you do this, I cannot emphasize this enough, part of the way you do this is you find opportunities to work together on the things you do agree about.
Absolutely.
You may disagree on some very important things, but you're going to find you agree on some important things as well. And some of the best modeling you can do is working together on those. So Cornel and I, for example, we have worked together in the defense of free speech, defense of freedom of religion.
Right.
We have worked together on just the very idea of defending democracy, defending Republican government.
That's right.
Many years ago, we published a letter trying to do something about the destructive spread of pornography on our own campus at Princeton. And, people saw that letter, Robbie George and Cornel West, saying, hey, pornography is a really damaging thing. It undermines the dignity of women. It teaches something false about ourselves, about our own humanity. It undermines the dignity of our own sexuality. People said, Robbie George and Cornel, this is before we were very well known as a partnership. Right. And people saw that and said, well, wait a minute. And I think we probably
drones too.
Yeah, and we condemned the indiscriminate use of drones. And people see that and they said, oh, wait a minute. These two guys are known to disagree about all sorts of important things, but here they are working together. This is why I use that word fruitful. It's not enough. It's not enough by way of the modeling to see two people who are known to disagree being nice to each other and shaking hands or even giving each other a hug. That's important. That's good. But the fruitful friendships that really need to be modeled are the ones where they are working together on some important things. We were together in founding the Academic Freedom Alliance, trying to protect freedom of speech on campuses is integral to the truth-seeking mission, just as freedom of religion is integral to the mission of spirituality, of seeking God. The freedom of speech is integral to the truth-seeking mission of colleges and universities. We're united on that, and we allow ourselves to be seen as working in unity on it. Now, do you think we might get a little pushback from our respective sides, so-called sides of the spectrum? Yeah, we're in trouble all the time. I'm not in trouble with the left. I am with the, but I'm in more trouble sometimes with the right than I am with the left. He's in more trouble sometimes with the left than he is on the right. Those are just the slings and arrows that come.
And the death threats. And the death threats. I mean, after the latest Supreme Court thing, I had to call my brother. I said, you and I, we got deep disagreements on this, brother, but I'm deeply concerned about you and Sister Cindy, and anything I can do, you let me know. You let me know. I said the same thing to Brother Alito last night. I was surprised. I didn't know he was going to be there. I kind of looked up and said, Alito, he's got a cousin in Italy or something. I know a brother named Alito. But after he finished, I just said, God bless you and your family. I know he's under threat. I said, we're going to be in struggle. Sometimes we'll clash. Many times we might clash. You praying for me, I'm praying for you. We're human beings. We got loved ones and attachments. And we're made in the image of God. Amen. And that's never reducible to politics.
And that's a really important point. Again, when it comes to the modeling, people need to see people who are able to criticize other people for their perspectives, for their activities, for their causes, without demonizing them. People need to see people disagreeing with other people and even fighting against whatever cause they want to advance while respecting their human dignity. That Jehovah's Witness, who's got a real problem with my being a Catholic because his teaching is that the Catholic Church is really bad, he can still respect my human dignity. As I mentioned before, his whole reason for reaching out to me, if he didn't care about me, he wouldn't be telling me what he's telling me. He just let me go, let me fall into perdition, fall into sin. But he wants to save me, and I can recognize that. I can honor that as much as I think he's wrong in his message to me. It's the same. You can criticize, Cornel has frequently criticized U.S. military policy and the people who are making U.S. military. Sometimes we've done it together, as in the drone thing. But we're not demonizing the people responsible for that. We're opposing the policy, but we are not questioning the fundamental human dignity of the people who are responsible for that. And this takes us back to that question of personalizing everything. We need to get past this. We should not allow ourselves to fall into the trap of believing that if you criticize me, my lifestyle, my religion, my way of thinking, you are attacking me personally. You may be, but you're probably not. And you aren't necessarily doing that at all. You're just saying I'm wrong about something, deeply wrong about something I may care about. But you're still able to respect my human dignity, and I am able to respect your human dignity.
We could call it the classical Christian conception of hatred. You hate the sin and still love the sinner. And that is a prolonged process, but it has spiritual quality to it. So you hate domination, you hate injustice, you hate exploitation. The dominator, still a human being who can change and be different and go another way. You see. So the hatred is against the sin. Yes, that's a sign that you're spiritually alive. But you start hating the sinner. Now you have absent yourself from being a sinner, a faltering, fallible, finite human being. And at that point, you've elevated yourself in such a way that it's unwarranted. Definitely. But we appreciate you all giving us all this time.
Oh, absolutely. And I think what you've given us is some joyful insight. And I say joyful in the sense of as Christians, we have to be engaged in joyful service, as St. Paul suggested. You've given us some insight into your friendship and the basis and how we can replicate that throughout our communities and our culture and our democracy. So we are eternally grateful to the two of you for what you've done by honoring us with your presence, and I want to thank you.
Thank you, Mark.